shadow of sacrifice. The night was thick with tension, its darkness impenetrable as a sense of impending doom loomed over the guerrillist regime. In the heart of Ruda's palace, the air crackled with a foreboding energy, the weight of dissent and unrest pressing down on those who served under the brutal dictator. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the silent cries of a nation on the brink, and within these walls, the generals gathered, their faces etched with worry and fear. General Karun, a man of unwavering principles and a deep sense of duty, could no longer stay silent. The sight of countless bodies in the streets, the screams of the innocent echoing in his mind, had driven him to the brink. He knew the risks of speaking out against Ruda, but he could not, in good conscience, continue to support the violent suppression of the people. Dr. Ruda, Karun began, his voice steady but laden with the weight of his words. We must reconsider our approach. The people's cries cannot be ignored forever. If we continue down this path, we risk the very foundation of our nation. We should negotiate, acknowledge Kodo's innocence, and listen to the people. The room fell silent, the other generals exchanging uneasy glances. Ruda's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening with every word that spilled from Karun's mouth. You suggest we negotiate? Ruda spat, his voice dripping with contempt. You dare propose that we bow to the demands of traitors and rebels? You question my authority? Karun met Ruda's gaze unflinchingly, his heart pounding in his chest. Dr. Ruda, it is not about questioning your authority. It is about preserving the unity of our nation. Water can carry a boat, but it can also capsize it. If we continue this bloodshed, we may find ourselves drowning in the chaos we've created. The tension in the room became unbearable, the other generals frozen in their seats, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Ruda's face contorted with rage, and in one swift motion, he reached for his gun. Without hesitation, he aimed and fired, the deafening crack of the gunshot echoing through the chamber. General Karun crumpled to the floor, a single bullet hole in his chest. His eyes, wide with shock, slowly dimmed as the life drained out of him. The room remained deathly silent, the other generals too stunned to react, their horror palpable as they stared at the fallen man. Let this be a lesson to any who dare defy me, Ruda snarled, his voice cold and emotionless. We will crush this rebellion with force, and anyone who stands in my way will meet the same fate as Karun. The remaining generals, paralyzed by fear, nodded in silent agreement, their loyalty to Ruda solidified by the raw display of his ruthlessness. The room, once filled with men of power and ambition, now felt like a tomb, suffocating in the stench of blood and fear. Meanwhile, in the suffocating confines of his prison cell, Kodo sat in silent contemplation, the echoes of Karun's final moments lost to him. The chains that bound him were a physical manifestation of the oppression that weighed heavily on his soul, but within the silence of his cell, he found a certain clarity of thought. His mind drifted to the greats of the past, figures who had shaped the course of history through sheer force of will, wisdom, and sacrifice. But even as he reflected on their greatness, he recognized the transience of their power. Every one of them had ultimately succumbed to the relentless march of time. Kodo's reflections were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps approaching his cell. The door creaked open, revealing the warden, a man who had once been a staunch enforcer of the regime but who had, over time, come to question the morality of his actions. The warden, a tall and gaunt figure, held a sharp saw in his hand, his eyes betraying a conflict of emotions. Kodo, the warden whispered, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence of the prison. I cannot bear to see this injustice any longer. I am here to set you free. Kodo's gaze met the warden's, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Then, with a slow nod, Kodo extended his hands, allowing the warden to saw through the metal cuffs that bound him. The sharp blade made quick work of the chains, and with each stroke, Kodo could feel the weight of his captivity beginning to lift. Why did you do this? Kodo asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside him. The warden hesitated, locking eyes with Kodo. I've done terrible things in the name of this regime, he admitted, his voice quivering with guilt. But I believe you can bring the change we so desperately need. I ask only one thing in return. Please pray for my soul, for I fear I am beyond redemption. Kodo remained silent, but his eyes reflected an understanding and shared burden. The warden, sensing Kodo's unspoken promise, nodded and motioned for him to follow. They moved swiftly through the winding prison corridors, the warden leading with the precision of a man who knew every nook and cranny. At last, they reached the main hallway, where 4 prison officers stood guard, oblivious to the unfolding events. The warden approached them with a calm, authoritative air that concealed his true intentions. "We're moving the prisoners," he announced, his voice steady. "Escort us to the main gate." The officers, unsuspecting and compliant, formed up around Kodo and the warden. But as they reached a secluded part of the corridor, the warden sprang into action. Drawing a concealed pistol, he fired swiftly and accurately, taking down 2 officers before they could react. The remaining officers, stunned and disoriented, drew their weapons, but Kodo seized the moment. He lunged at the nearest officer, and a brutal struggle ensued, fists and gunshots exchanged in a deadly dance. Driven by a primal will to survive, Kodo fought with the ferocity of desperation. The loose handcuffs on his wrists became weapons, smashing into the skull of one officer, knocking him out cold. The second officer, panicked, fired wildly, the bullet grazing Kodo's shoulder but failing to stop him. With a final burst of strength, Kodo wrestled the gun from the officer's hand and ended the fight with a single, precise shot. Silence fell over the hallway, the bodies of the fallen officers lying motionless on the cold stone floor. But the warden had not escaped unscathed. Amid the chaos, he had been struck by a stray bullet. Slumping against the wall, blood poured from a wound in his abdomen as he looked up at Kodo with a pained expression. "Kodo," the warden gasped, his voice weak and strained. "I did what I could, but this is the end for me." Kodo knelt beside him, his heart heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The warden, his breathing labored, reached out with a trembling hand, gripping Kodo's arm. With "my last breath," the warden whispered, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, "I beg you, pray for me in heaven." "Your Holiness." Moved by the warden's final plea, Kodo nodded solemnly, the words hanging in the air like a sacred oath. The warden loosened his grip, and with his last trembling breath, his eyes closed forever. Kodo slowly rose, his body aching, his mind reeling from the violence that had erupted in his quest for freedom. But there was no time to mourn, no time to dwell on the losses. As night continued to fall, Kodo moved swiftly, blending into the shadows, leaving behind the fallen and broken, a stark reminder of the steep price of freedom. Outside, the city roiled with unrest, the sounds of protests growing louder and more ferocious with each passing hour. But even as the storm raged, Kodo's mind remained clear. He knew his escape was only the beginning, that the true fight for justice had just begun. And as he vanished into the night, one thought gripped him: he would not rest until the sacrifices for freedom were honored, until the blood spilled was avenged, and until the people's cries for justice were answered. The dawn of shadows. In the hidden recesses of a dimly lit sanctuary, far from the prying eyes of Ruda's regime, Kodo stood before his most trusted followers. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, mirroring the gravity of the task that lay before them. Kodo's presence commanded respect and attention, his voice a quiet yet powerful force that carried the weight of a plan so audacious it could topple the tyrant who had ruled over the continent with an iron fist. "We have reached a point where words alone will not suffice," Kodo began, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of each of his followers. "Ruda's tyranny has gone unchecked for too long, but we are the architects of change. It is time to act, to reclaim our freedom, and to restore justice to this land." His words resonated deeply within those gathered, each one committed to the cause with an intensity that bordered on fervor. Kodo outlined the plan with meticulous detail, knowing that the success of their mission depended on precision and unwavering commitment. Every role was assigned with care, each person entrusted with a task critical to the overall strategy. "You," Kodo said, pointing to a group of seasoned protesters, "will be the face of our movement. Your task is to lead continuous protests, to keep the military's attention fixed on the streets. Let them think they are quelling the resistance while we work in the shadows." The protesters nodded in unison, fully aware of the risks, but undeterred by the prospect of facing Ruda's brutal enforcers. Their role was essential, drawing the regime's gaze away from the real threat simmering beneath the surface. Kodo continued, his tone becoming more urgent as he addressed the broader group. While the protests rage on, we will be reaching out across the continent. We must build alliances with those who share our vision, a network of believers who are willing to stand against this oppressive regime. We will communicate through covert channels, use coded messages, and work in secrecy. Every connection we forge strengthens our cause. The room was silent, the gravity of the mission hanging in the air like a dense fog. Each individual present knew the stakes. Failure meant certain death, not just for them, but for the hope of freedom across the continent. Yet, Kodo's unwavering confidence inspired them, giving them the courage to press on. The jasmine flower, Kodo continued, his voice soft but filled with conviction, blooms quietly, yet its fragrance spreads far and wide. So too will our revolution. We must move like shadows, silent and unseen, yet our impact must be felt in every corner of this land. Kodo's followers listened intently, understanding that their strength lay in the secrecy and the subtlety of their movements. They were not just rebels, they were a silent army, an assembly of individuals from all walks of life, united by a common cause. From national representatives to military generals, Kodo said, emphasizing the broad reach of their movement, from intellectuals to ordinary citizens, our revolution must encompass all who dream of a better future. The key is in our unity, and our shared belief that together, we can topple the tyrant. As the weeks turned into months, Kodo's plan began to take shape. Protests erupted with increasing frequency across the continent, their intensity growing with each passing day. Ruda's military found themselves locked in a battle on multiple fronts, struggling to suppress the rising tide of dissent. Yet, despite the growing unrest, Ruda remained blind to the true danger. His intelligence network, once feared for its ruthlessness and efficiency, failed to penetrate the layers of secrecy that surrounded Kodo's movement. The regime's enforcers, confident in their power, were oblivious to the silent revolution taking place right under their noses. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Kodo's alliances grew stronger. His message of hope and redemption resonated with those who had suffered under Ruda's rule, drawing them into the fold. The movement became a force to be reckoned with, a silent tide rising against the oppressive weight of the regime. One day, as Kodo stood in the sanctuary, reviewing the progress of the movement, a young messenger approached him, breathless and wide-eyed. "Sir," the boy stammered, "the protests, they're growing larger. More people are joining every day. The military, they're struggling to contain it." Kodo nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good," he replied, his voice calm. "Let them focus on the protests. Our work is far from done." The protests served their purpose well, diverting the attention of Ruda's forces while the real work of the revolution continued in the shadows. Kodo's followers, acting as the architects of this silent revolution, moved with purpose and precision. Each act of defiance, each covert meeting, brought them closer to their ultimate goal, the overthrow of Ruda's oppressive regime. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the sanctuary grew more tense. The weight of the impending confrontation loomed over them all, but Kodo remained steadfast, his resolve unshaken by the challenges ahead. He knew that their actions were not just about removing a tyrant from power, but about giving the people of the continent a future free from fear and oppression. Meanwhile, on the streets, the protests continued to grow in size and intensity. The people, emboldened by the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggle, became more defiant in their demands for justice and freedom. The military's attempts to suppress the demonstrations only fueled the anger of the masses, and the clashes between protesters and soldiers grew increasingly violent. Ruda, consumed by his obsession with maintaining control, grew more paranoid with each passing day. He saw enemies everywhere, even among those closest to him. His advisors, once confident in their positions, now lived in constant fear of incurring the dictator's wrath. The tides of rebellion. In a momentous turn of events, Kodo, the spiritual leader who had once been shackled in a guerrilla's prison cell, was now elevated to the highest position of military authority, the chairman of the War Council. This prestigious position, symbolizing the pinnacle of strategic command, was a testament to the unwavering trust and confidence that the people and the military forces of the resistance had placed in him. The War Council, an assembly of military generals from the liberated nations of Leonias, Tegera, Birais, and Wolfia, was now united under Kodo's leadership, each nation bringing its own unique military expertise and strategic insight to the table. Notably absent from this coalition were Hyaenia and Leopardia, two nations notorious for their oppressive dictatorships and unwavering allegiance to the guerrillists. Kodo, now bearing the heavy responsibility of orchestrating the resistance against Ruda's tyrannical regime, wasted no time in laying out his audacious plan. His strategy was both bold and meticulously calculated, a dual-pronged assault that aimed to strike at the very heart of guerrillist power, both from within and without. We will divide our forces and our efforts, attacking on multiple fronts, Kodo began, addressing the gathered generals with the calm confidence of a seasoned leader. His eyes, sharp with determination, scanned the room, ensuring he had the full attention of every military mind present. The guerrillists believe they are invincible, but they have not faced a coordinated attack like the one we will launch. The generals, hardened by years of battle and war, listened intently. Tegera's General Varric, a bear of a man with a reputation for his ferocity in battle, nodded approvingly. "What do you propose, Chairman?" Varric asked, his voice gruff but respectful. Kodo laid out his plan with precision. "Internally, we will stoke the fires of dissent within Guerrillist itself. Our network of followers has already planted the seeds of rebellion, protests, strikes, and acts of defiance will rise in frequency and intensity. The guerrillist regime will be forced to turn its focus inward, dividing its attention and resources." General Anaya of Leonias, a woman known for her sharp intellect and tactical brilliance, leaned forward, her keen mind already working through the implications of Kodo's strategy. And externally, she prompted, her tone eager for the details of the military offensive. "Externally, we will strike from all sides," Kodo continued, his voice firm. Tegera and Wolfia will mobilize their forces for a ground assault along Guerrillist's western and eastern borders. Meanwhile, Leonias and Birais will launch a maritime infiltration, bringing troops into guerrillist territory under the guise of trade vessels. Our troops will be deployed in small, discreet groups, moving under the cover of darkness to infiltrate deep into enemy territory. General Horam of Birais, a seasoned strategist with a weathered face and a mind as sharp as any blade, stroked his chin thoughtfully. "It's a bold plan," he acknowledged, "but it hinges on maintaining the element of surprise. If Guerrillist catches wind of our movements, they could fortify their defenses and turn the tide against us." Kodo nodded, fully aware of the risks involved. "That is why our followers within Guerrillist will play a crucial role. They will ensure that the arrival of our forces by sea goes undetected. Their loyalty to our cause is unwavering, and they will provide clandestine support wherever possible." The room fell silent as the weight of Kodo's words settled over the assembly. The plan was ambitious, but it was also their best chance to topple Ruda's regime and bring freedom to the continent. General Laros of Wolfia, a man with a reputation for his unwavering loyalty and disciplined approach, broke the silence. "The people believe in you, Kodo. They see you as more than just a leader, they see you as their hope for a better future. We will follow your lead." Kodo's gaze softened, a rare flicker of emotion crossing his face. "This is not just about me," he said quietly. "This is about all of us, about the people who have suffered under Ruda's tyranny for far too long. This is about giving them a future where they can live in peace and freedom. We fight for them, and we fight for the generations that will come after us." The generals exchanged determined glances, the resolve in the room growing stronger with every word Kodo spoke. They knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes. Failure was not an option. They could not allow Ruda's reign of terror to continue. With the War Council's full support, Kodo set the plan into motion. In Tegera and Wolfia, troops began mobilizing, their movements swift and silent as they prepared for the ground assaults. In Leonias and Birais, trade vessels were quietly retrofitted to transport troops, their true purpose hidden beneath layers of secrecy. As the days passed, the tension on the continent grew palpable. The people of Gorilist, already weary of Ruda's oppressive rule, began to sense that something was coming, something that could change the course of their lives forever. Protests became more frequent, more defiant, as the seeds of rebellion took root in the hearts of the people. Meanwhile, the infiltration of Gorilist by sea was carried out with a level of precision that left nothing to chance. The troops from Leoni's and Birais, moving under the cover of darkness and guided by Kodo's followers, slipped past Gorilist patrols and began their advance into the heart of enemy territory. Inside Gorilist, the resistance movement, now operating with the full backing of Kodo's strategic plan, continued to gain momentum. Acts of defiance against Ruda's regime grew bolder, from sabotage of military supplies to the dissemination of anti-Gorilist propaganda. Kodo's network worked tirelessly to maintain the element of surprise, their actions coordinated with military precision. As the pieces of Kodo's master plan fell into place, it became clear that this was no ordinary rebellion. It was a meticulously orchestrated campaign to bring an end to Ruda's reign. The dual-pronged assault, both internal and external, was designed to stretch the Gorilist regime to its breaking point. But as the resistance forces drew closer to their goal, Kodo knew that the final confrontation was inevitable. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, one that would determine not just the fate of Gorilist, but the future of the entire continent. As Kodo stood at the helm of this great movement, he understood the gravity of what lay ahead. The lives of countless people, the future of nations, rested on the success of their mission. Failure would mean the continued suffering of millions under Ruda's iron fist, but success would usher in a new era of peace and freedom. With a heart full of resolve and a mind sharpened by years of hardship, Kodo prepared himself for the battle to come. The time for planning was over, the time for action had arrived. And as the forces of resistance closed in on their target, Kodo knew that the outcome of this war would shape the destiny of the continent. The Silent Storm. The initiation of Kodo's silent resistance marked a pivotal turning point in the struggle against the oppressive reign of the Gorilists. In the dimly lit war room, surrounded by maps, intelligence reports, and the trusted generals of the War Council, Kodo outlined the strategy that would shape the future of the continent. The atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation, each individual acutely aware of the gravity of the decisions being made. Kodo, with his calm demeanor and unwavering resolve, laid out his plan, a plan rooted not in brute force, but in the art of strategy and the careful consideration of ethics. The decision to avoid missile strikes on cities was not just a tactical move, it was a moral one. Kodo knew that the path to victory could not be paved with the blood of innocents. He was determined to win this war not just by defeating the Gorilists, but by upholding the principles that had drawn so many to his cause. As Kodo spoke, his voice steady and measured, the generals listened intently, their eyes fixed on him. "We cannot match the Gorilists in sheer military power," Kodo began, his tone resolute. "But we can outmaneuver them. We can strike where they least expect it, disrupt their operations, and weaken them from within. Our strength lies not in overwhelming force, but in our ability to think strategically, to adapt, and to surprise." Step 1 of Kodo's plan was to orchestrate widespread protests within the heartlands of Gorilist territory. These demonstrations were more than just acts of civil disobedience. They were carefully planned diversions designed to draw the attention of the Gorilist army away from strategic targets. By tying up a significant portion of Gorilist forces in the cities and towns, the protests would create openings for the resistance to exploit. "These protests will serve as the first wave of our assault," Kodo explained, pointing to key locations on the map. "They will be coordinated to erupt simultaneously across Gorilist territory, forcing the regime to spread their forces thin. The people have already shown their willingness to stand up against Ruda's tyranny. Now, we will give them the opportunity to strike a blow for their own freedom." The generals exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of admiration and concern. They knew that the protesters would be putting themselves in great danger, but they also understood the necessity of this move. The Gorilists had to be weakened from within before any external assault could have a chance of success. Step 2 involved the launch of a powerful offensive from Tajera and Wolfia. These two nations, with their well-trained armies and strategic positions on guerrillists' western and eastern borders, would deliver a coordinated assault designed to force the guerrillists into a defensive posture. The objective was not to conquer territory, but to draw out the guerrillist forces, stretch their resources, and expose their vulnerabilities. General Varick of Tajara, a man known for his ferocity in battle, spoke up. "Our troops are ready, Chairman. We'll strike hard and fast, keep them on their heels. But we'll need to be prepared for a strong counterattack." Kodo nodded. "Indeed. That's where Step 3 comes in. While the guerrillists are preoccupied with the attacks from Tajara and Wolfia, we'll move to the next phase." Step 3 was perhaps the most daring of Kodo's plans. As the guerrillist army mobilized to respond to the external assaults, Birais and Leoniais, along with the resistance forces, would infiltrate the guerrillist capital of Hunxi. This would not be a frontal assault but a covert operation, with troops quietly slipping into the city through various entry points, exploiting the chaos and confusion that would ensue. General Anaya of Leoniais, her sharp mind already working through the logistics, raised a question. "Chairman, the infiltration will require precision and coordination. How do we ensure that our forces can move undetected?" Kodo turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "We'll use the same networks that have kept the resistance alive within Guerrillist. Our supporters inside the capital will guide our troops, provide safe houses, and help us navigate the city. The element of surprise is our greatest ally. The guerrillists will be so focused on the external threat that they won't see us coming." The room fell silent as the generals absorbed the enormity of what was being proposed. The infiltration of Hunxi was a high-risk operation, but if successful, it could cripple the guerrillist regime and bring them to their knees. Finally, Kodo addressed the last and most secretive part of his plan, Step 4. This phase was known only to him, a strategy kept hidden even from his closest allies. The mystery surrounding Step 4 added an element of unpredictability to the resistance's actions, ensuring that the guerrillists would be caught off guard when the time came. "The final phase of our plan," Kodo said, his voice lowering slightly, "is one that I must keep to myself for now. Trust that when the moment arrives, you will understand why it has been kept secret. But know this, Step 4 will be the decisive blow, the one that will bring Ruta's regime crashing down." The generals exchanged uneasy glances, but none questioned Kodo's decision. His leadership had guided them this far, and they had faith that whatever he had planned, it would be the key to their victory. As the meeting concluded, Kodo's followers prepared to set his plan into motion. The protests were organized with meticulous care, their timing synchronized to create the maximum impact. The armies of Tajara and Wolfia began their preparations for the assault, their movements swift and coordinated. In Birais and Leoniais, troops were discreetly mobilized, ready to slip into the guerrillist capital when the time came. The stage was set for an epic confrontation, a battle not just of armies, but of wills. Kodo's strategy was one of patience and precision, of using the enemy's strengths against them and exploiting every weakness. It was a strategy that recognized the limitations of the resistance forces and turned those limitations into advantages. But as the wheels of Kodo's plan began to turn, the stakes grew higher with each passing day. The resistance was now fully committed, and there was no turning back. The future of the continent hung in the balance, and the outcome of this conflict would determine the fate of millions. In the days that followed, the streets of Guerrillist were filled with the sound of protest, the voices of the people rising in defiance against their oppressors. The Guerrillist regime, caught off guard by the scale and coordination of the demonstrations, scrambled to maintain control. But as the resistance's plan unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary uprising. The silenced warning. After months of meticulous preparation, the resistance forces across Tajara, Leoniais, Birais, and Wolfia stood poised for war. Tension crackled in the air, the final signal for battle awaited from Kodo. Meanwhile, within the heart of the guerrillist intelligence network, alarms were quietly raised as officers began to notice a troubling pattern: significant military mobilization from the four countries, far more than routine maneuvers. A detailed report, brimming with urgency, was swiftly compiled and transmitted to the Intelligence Command Center. In a dimly lit office, the leader of the intelligence unit, a man known for his ruthless pragmatism, sat behind his desk. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of machinery and the occasional rustle of papers. His stern face was illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp, his sharp eyes scanning the latest intelligence briefings. The door creaked open, and one of his officers entered, his expression a mix of anxiety and resolve. "Sir, we're facing an emergency," the intelligence officer began, his voice steady but laced with concern. "The four countries, Tajara, Leonias, Birais, and Wolfia, are mobilizing their armies. It's not the usual posturing. It seems they're preparing for an attack on our territory." The leader, whom many referred to simply as the boss, barely looked up from his papers. "Perhaps it's just routine military exercises in our colonies," he replied dismissively. "There's no cause for concern. The four colonial countries wouldn't dare attack their celestial kingdom. That would only lead them down the path of death." The officer, undeterred by his superior's nonchalance, stepped closer to the desk, his voice growing firmer. "Sir, intelligence suggests that this is the most significant military mobilization since the last war ended. This isn't routine. They're gearing up for something big. We need to report this to the Datu immediately." The boss finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he studied the officer's face. "No, they wouldn't dare," he repeated, his tone more forceful. "You're overreacting." "With all due respect, sir," the officer pressed on, his frustration beginning to show, "if we don't take this seriously, we could be caught off guard. The Data needs to know. I request permission to escalate this to his attention." For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with tension. The boss's expression hardened, and without a word, he reached into his desk drawer. In one swift motion, he pulled out a gun and aimed it at the officer. The intelligence officer barely had time to register the movement before a deafening shot rang out. The bullet struck him squarely in the chest, and he crumpled to the floor, his life snuffed out in an instant. The boss stood, his gun still smoking, and looked down at the lifeless body. "No intelligence is allowed to reach the Datu's desk," he muttered coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Especially not this." The room fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind filtering through the window. The boss calmly returned the gun to his desk drawer, his face a mask of steely resolve. He stepped over the fallen officer, moving towards the door as if nothing had happened. Outside, the world continued its relentless march, oblivious to the treachery that had just unfolded within the intelligence headquarters. But within those walls, something had irrevocably changed. The fragile fabric of trust that held the intelligence community together had been torn, replaced by a chilling awareness that loyalty to the regime outweighed all else, even the truth. As the boss exited the room, he gave a brief order to the guards outside. "Clean this up," he said curtly. "No trace." The guards nodded and entered the office, their faces impassive as they began to remove the body. They were accustomed to such orders, having long ago learned that silence was the key to survival in the shadowy world of intelligence. As they worked, the boss walked down the corridor, his mind already shifting to the next task at hand. The warning had been silenced, and for now, the threat had been neutralized. But the boss knew that the storm was still coming, one that would test the limits of even his ironclad control. As he reached his private office, the boss sat down and began drafting a new report, one that would downplay the significance of the military mobilizations, framing them as minor exercises. He knew the Datu would read the report and dismiss any concerns, just as he had intended. But even as he penned his careful lies, a gnawing doubt lingered at the back of his mind. The intelligence officer's words echoed in his ears, a reminder that the truth could not be silenced forever. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, no amount of deception would be able to stop it. Outside the intelligence headquarters, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and carrying with it the scent of change. The people of Gorillist, long oppressed under Ruda's rule, were stirring. And though they did not yet know it, the seeds of rebellion had been sown, watered by the blood of those who dared to speak the truth. The storm was coming, and it would sweep across the land with a fury that would leave no stone unturned. In the quiet corners of the resistance, Kodo and his followers waited, biding their time, knowing that the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. And when it came, they would be ready.